This episode is brought to you by True America Multifamily, one of the nation's leading multifamily investment firms. In 2025, True America partnered with Manulife Investment Management to launch the $1 billion joint venture, Anchor Point Residential, created to acquire and preserve income-restricted multifamily communities, supported by low-income housing tax credits, LIHTC. The initiative begins with 51 properties, about 6,000 units across California, Texas, and Washington.
Welcome to Building Better Communities. I'm Bob Hart. Today I'm sitting down with Dirk Wakeham. He's been at the inflection point of technology and real estate over 3 decades. And he's now the president and CEO, the returning conqueror of RealPage. Like Napoleon, he came back, but he's a little taller than Napoleon, I think. If you don't know who RealPage is, they are the leading AI-powered software platform for the entire real estate industry. They really define what proptech is. They're the gold standard. They serve more than 24 million rental units worldwide. I think 1 million of those might be mine, Dirk, right? No, I'm kidding. Not that many. We're a big customer, in full disclosure. But Dirk's story goes well beyond RealPage, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to really cover some topics about proptech and what that means to the real estate industry and the influence going forward of AI and how technology is really impacting our business. So let me just tell you a little bit more about Dirk. He is a 5th generation native of California. I think he was here. His family moved here when the Indians were here, back in Orange County. His grandfather, I think, owned a bean field. Is that right, Dirk?
That's right. Yeah, he was a bean farmer, lima bean farmer.
That's when there was. That's before the Irvine Company started building all those homes.
That's right.
So he grew up in the real estate business. He learned the fundamentals from his father and his grandfather, and that early exposure is what set the course for everything that followed. So he's a tried and true real estate professional. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from Cal State Fullerton.
The Harvard of Orange County.
I think, right?
Kevin Costner, that's right. You did your research.
That's right. Dirk has served as CEO, president, and founder of not 1, not 2, but 6 technology and real estate software companies. He founded a company called Leasing Desk back in the dinosaur era of '99 when proptech wasn't even proptech. And he built that through the dot-com bust, and he sold it to RealPage in 2007, which later led to his becoming president of that company once before, and was part of the leadership team with Steve Wynn when the company went public in 2010. And then he left RealPage in 2013, and he went on to lead many other technology companies, including, if I'm pronouncing it right, Dirk, Zego. Which he grew and was eventually acquired by Global Payments, and a transaction valued at almost $925 million. You couldn't get another $75 million to make it $1 billion, Dirk? What happened?
I call it $1 billion exit because we had several offers over $1 billion, but Global was the logical buyer, so we sold it to them for cheaper than.
Okay, they got the best. They got the award because they were the best. He served after that as managing director at Vista Equities, which is a huge software private equity investment platform. And last November, he could not resist. The call came, and Dirk returned to RealPage as its returning CEO. Like Alexander the Great coming back, right? And that move is described by Dirk as coming home. He's stepping in a pivotal moment for the company. The company's been through some transition recently, and for the industry, particularly as artificial intelligence is reshaping how we as an industry operate in multifamily and how we manage and how we think about the business as a whole. Dirk, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate the opportunity.
You bet. So, Dirk, let's go back to Orange County when there were bean fields, okay? You're a 5th generation Southern California native. You grew up in the real estate business. You learned it from your dad. How did that exposure shape what you did going forward?
So thank you. My dad, he drove a truck for a living. He was a gas truck driver, and he inherited some money from his grandfather in like 1970, and took that money and bought my mom a house that she well deserved. And then he took the rest of the money and bought a 4 unit apartment building in Costa Mesa, California. And, what did I learn from the industry? Well, for one, I learned it's a pretty blocking and tackling industry. I had the pleasure of learning the business by mowing lawns and painting apartments and, holding the drywall knife and all the things as, he had to do the work because it was the way you did it back then. You were an entrepreneur and you did the work yourself. And so he did a lot of that work.
That's how I started doing it myself.
That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
And, so I quickly learned, like, I didn't like that side of the business. I didn't necessarily want to be burning my Saturdays, pushing a lawnmower around and, being the tool guy for my dad. And so, I developed an appreciation for, one, I think the long-term value and annuity that real estate can create. Over his lifetime, he held on to a lot of the properties that he invested in, and they were great cash flow generators in his retirement. So this whole
Investing in housing?
In housing, yes. So this long-term sort of value creation, annuity creation, was something I certainly learned from him. Patience. I also learned, and maybe a little bit later in my career, when I went to work for a group in Orange County, Western National Properties. Sort of learned the value of cash flow. And I'll never forget, I was a young guy and I came in and I had this idea to, do a thing. And I was talking about ROI and I was talking about, return on equity and all these fancy sort of business school terms. And, one of the principals of that company sat me down and he said, Dirk, let me explain something. Mike.
Famous Mike.
Famous Mike. Mike said, look, Dirk, that's great. I know you got this great education and, you want to talk about, he goes, I'm a real estate guy. He goes, I understand one thing, and that's cash flow. So whatever you bring me an idea, talk to me about how that improves the cash flow of the property or the idea you're having or whatever.
Still applies today.
Still applies.
So you were grounded in the fundamentals, both as a young man through family, but then as an executive at Western National. What years were those?
So I started Western National in 1986. I was still actually in college at the time.
Oh, you were early mover there, and company's still doing well today. It's one of the
they've had a
stalwart companies.
Long-term holder of real estate, been around a long time.
Yeah.
Still have a lot of the deals they originally built in the 60s and 70s.
So your first venture sounds like it was Leasing Desk. And I guess almost 27 years ago, or you founded it in 99, but then you sold to RealPage in 27. Talk about Leasing Desk, what the premise was. I know they obviously did some automated lease workflows and resident screening in those days. So tell us a little bit more about it and how that came about.
Yeah, so I sort of saw an opportunity this was about the first generation web applications. Everything was going to the web. Everybody was going to be a .com millionaire. People were starting businesses. And I sort of saw real estate as an opportunity to sort of digitize some of the first workflows that were ripe for that sort of automation. So things around, resident shows up, how do you get the lease documented? How do you get them properly screened? At that time we were using fax machines to send in an application and make sure the credit was good and they weren't a criminal and all that stuff.
Early fax, they would curl up on you.
Exactly. And so, I had a vision to sort of automate many of those processes. We raised a seed round of capital and the folks at Western National were gracious enough to be one of the early investors in that. We had big visions. We burned through all that cash pretty quickly, and we sat in 2001, right when the crash happened. And, we had some initial kind of what we now call MVP or minimum viable product, but we didn't have enough money to make payroll going forward. And so we, what everybody now affectionately calls a pivot, we just laid off a bunch of people so we could make payroll and keep going, and raised another bridge round of capital to get us going. And so what that forced us to do was really narrow the vision of the company. And really sort of focused on insurance and some of the screening products, and kind of shelved the whole leasing workflow automation vision. It obviously has been solved many years later, but it took a lot.
I think there were a lot of early proptech companies, as I recall, when I started 6 years ago, Kennedy Wilson, that it was like the boom bust of the tech era, only for real estate, that had great ideas but couldn't really be transformative to build actually a platform that was sustainable.
Yeah, I think the beauty of doing this stuff in real estate is, the industry tends to be several years behind, maybe what people consider leading edge businesses like retail or other verticals. And so, the good news is you can sort of figure out what people are doing in other verticals, and you bring those ideas and concepts into real estate, and it gives you the opportunity to sort of be an innovator, even though you're probably a little bit of a follower based on what may be going on in other industries.
So when you sold Leasing Desk, that was already 2007. That was really the intro to RealPage the first time because that's what required you,
Well, sort of.
sort of.
So I met Steve
Yeah.
before I started Leasing Desk.
Oh, you
Steve
did?
Wynn, the original founder.
Yes, he's
We were actually customers of RealPage at Western National. We bought the rent roll product, which was the predecessor to the current platform. It was a DOS-based property management software business, and as having an IT role at Western National, I was involved in sort of selecting that system and putting it in place, et cetera. So that was where I first met Steve, and so I sort of watched their trajectory and what RealPage is doing as I was doing my own company and trying to find our niche within this ecosystem.
got it. Steve was really, he still is, but really a true pioneer as an engineer and then as an entrepreneur, and really believed in a lot of these platforms and put a lot of stakes in the ground. Must have been very exciting to work with a man like that.
There were times, and I've told Steve this, at times I thought he was completely crazy in a good way, and other times where, I thought he was a genius. Steve had this uncanny ability to see where the puck was going, not just 12 months from now, but 5 years from now. When I met him in the late 90s, he started describing, this cloud database and all these systems and sending information up into the cloud. And he didn't call it the cloud. It was, sort of these hosted servers that he had, and, being able to benchmark all this data from all these properties and provide insights. And I said, well, that's great, Steve. People just they want a web-based property management system. I know that's a great vision, but you're sort of, you're trying to solve this huge problem. And what your customers really want today is just to solve this one little problem, which is how do I do accounting in a more efficient way?
I think we're all, seeking that level of cost efficiency and delivery efficiency for our customers and to make the workflows go smoother. So you then sold the company. You're now running RealPage. You're in place there for about 4 years, and you really more than doubled the revenue during that period of time. Talk about that. Talk about the IPO a little bit and that transition from really growing it as a fledgling software company to really an institutional, scalable public company.
It was a really exciting time to be here. The first tour, if you will. We were very acquisitive back then. Steve always had a desire to do acquisitions, and so I was able to find other companies or other entrepreneurs that were had a great business or a great idea, and was able to convince them to sort of hook their train to RealPage, which then had a platform of scale, and we were able to give them leverage and get their product to grow into other areas, into other customers that maybe were more fragmented, et cetera. Because we had 100 salespeople, and that was 10 times what any of these companies we were talking to had. So we gave them a lot of sales coverage and market coverage, and obviously the ability to do creative pricing and packaging and those sorts of things. So it was a really exciting time as we found new product areas, acquired those businesses, integrated them into our core suite. You mentioned it was growing very, very rapidly. I think many of the companies we ended up acquiring, everybody back then had a vision. Hey, I want to take a company public, and I want to go ring the bell and do that whole thing. And so part of it was, hey, join the party here. We've got an IPO path company here. We have a great opportunity for you to sort of see your vision through in a way that is going to get you there a lot faster than if you try to do it on your own.
I think I don't know exactly in RealPage's history, but went on a major acquisition binge. You bought over 60 different companies, which has led to a suite of over 100 different products, I believe.
That's right.
Yeah, it's amazing aggregation. So 4 years at the helm of RealPage, you decide to go into private equity to Vista. What was the pivot about there? Why did you do that?
So, had a great run here. It became pretty clear to me that there was going to have to be some transformational work done as you acquire all these businesses and you get on this public company treadmill. Well, first of all, backing up, so the public IPO is great. You think you want to ring the bell. Everybody's excited about that opportunity to go do it. What you quickly realize is now
Been there once, ringing a bell. Fun.
yeah, that day is fun, but then it's like, wow, we got to get back to work. I got to go hit a number in the next 90 days and the next 90 days after that.
Right.
It's not a big liquidity event. You sort of can mark your shares and say, well, hey, now I'm worth X.
Oh, it's a big accounting event.
That's right. The bankers all
Big
get paid. The
compliance
accounts,
event.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
But what you realize is, well, now you can't always sell your stock, and it's not always liquid. So, and then you figure out this treadmill very quickly, which is, you're only as good as your last 90 days, and you start to make decisions about your business for how is that going to impact, this next quarter and the quarter after that. And, so it was fun and I enjoyed it, but I thought, there's probably more to life than, being a number two guy in a public company, and especially one that's done so many acquisitions and probably needs some, a little bit of a reset over time. And so I figured the company would probably go private. It did go private. It took 10 years. I thought it would take 2. So I was off by, 5X, but it eventually did go private. And, through that process, I learned about private equity. I saw what big, large private equity firms were doing with software companies, particularly founder-led software companies, and how they were implementing their playbooks as private companies where they could go in and think about a 4-year horizon, make investments, do transformational work. And so I sort of sought Vista out and said, like, I want to learn how these guys do what they do. I want to learn how they make money. I want to learn how they make companies more efficient. I want to learn how they grow companies. And, Vista is sort of renowned for their, quote unquote playbook, although they don't call it that anymore. But, their sort of suite of best practices and how they can go create value in companies. And I wanted to learn how they do it. So that was really
I'm
good.
sure you're a very attractive resource for them because of your experience in the early stages of software and proptech.
For sure. I think, the real world experience, probably seeing what happens in early stage companies. And, again, I wanted to learn the late stage side of it. So it was really a good fit. It was a good firm, a good place for me to hang my hat for almost over a decade.
And you're involved with, looks like a large number of different businesses, from Lanyon to Evo Commerce, Storage. I mean, it's a whole bunch of verticals.
Yeah, I sort of said, I want to learn other verticals. I was my whole life in real estate. Again, my parents were real estate people. I started building software for real estate. Actually built my mom an Excel spreadsheet that she used. Wasn't Excel,
Really?
It was Lotus 123 to do accounting of our rents way back. And I said, there's probably something else. So I want to learn, like, what are these other, what other verticals are. And so I did a tour at Lanyon, which is an event management software company. Eventually got merged into Cvent, which is probably the largest event platform software company. And then Kibo Commerce is an e-commerce, company that provides, websites and order management services for, for a variety of retail brands. And then got the opportunity to go back into proptech after I figured I learned it a little bit. I said, I kind of like the proptech world. I kind of know real estate. I understand the customer base, understand what motivates, how people make money in real estate, understand what happens in a leasing office on a Saturday, and decided I wanted to go back in. So I got the opportunity to go run a business called Paylease that we eventually rebranded to Zego under the Vista ownership. Zego.
Yeah, that was your last one before returning to RealPage. And that's the one you sold for just under $1 billion on exit.
To Global Payments, yeah.
Yeah. From zero to selling it. Or was it already started when you were
So it had been through several sponsors. I think we were the third. I think Vista was the third private equity investor. In fact, a little bit of a funny story about that one. I was still working at Kibo, and one of the partners at Vista called me up and said, hey, we're looking at this business called Paylease. Would you help us look at it? And I said, I know the business, actually. I know the sponsor and I know the CEO, and, happy to take a look at it. They got all the materials, and I said, hey guys, this is not a great business. You guys probably shouldn't invest in this. And they decided to go ahead and invest in it anyway. They hired a new CEO. He came in for about a year, and then a year later, the partner calls me back up and says, yeah, well, we bought it, as you know, we could really use your help to figure out how we transform the business. It was primarily a payments business at the time. They just, made a fee for moving money from a resident bank account to a property owner bank account. And, my vision was always sort of, you have to do more than that. That's kind of a commodity and a race to zero. And so we sort of pivoted the business to do more around resident experience and, provide more value to the property owner and to the resident as part of that process.
Really, okay, so the value proposition was for the property owner in terms of the way you couldn't really charge a resident back for that, I assume.
Well, actually, the business model at Zego is primarily a convenience fee model, which is you can pay your rent with a check for no fee, or if you need to pay online or you're traveling and you want to pay electronically, you can use your credit card to do that, and we charge you a fee in order
They
to
were
use your
just
credit.
happy if people pay.
That's right. That's right.
I'll
And
take
we had data
it.
to show that more people pay on time and all that stuff.
Well, I think there's a lot of great tools out there. This was certainly one of them to really accelerate payment, to reduce delinquency and so forth. And you've been in a lot of the service offerings. So you now sell it. Who did you sell it to? Did you sell it to RealPage?
So no, Zego got sold to Global Payments.
Oh, Global Payments.
Yeah,
Okay.
Global Payments. We ran a process, banker process. We had multiple offers. RealPage played in the process. They couldn't get to the same value that Global got to. And so, the beauty of the Global transaction, as I joked, there was no role and no roll. So there was no job for me, and there was no equity rollover. So, a lot of times private equities, okay, well, we'll pay you X, but you gotta put half your money back in the ground, and you got to go work for another 4 to 7 years to get it out.
Yeah, that's pretty typical. When we talk about whether it be Zego or other things, we hear the terms fintech and then we hear the terms proptech. How would you define them differently? How would you contrast them? Well, it's the same thing in your mind.
So, fintech typically is defined by something that is an automation of a banking process or technology around, movement of money, lending of money, those sorts of things. Prop tech are things that are kind of built world technology. So, what are you doing for, to help a property owner optimize, run their property more efficiently, outperform their competitors, all those things. I think the third one I'd throw in there, which is kind of where Leasing Desk was a little more of an insurtech play because we had insurance products in there. It's maybe a subset of fintech, but
Like renters insurance?
Renters insurance. That's right.
Yeah. Which is
Renters
such a good
liability.
value for the consumer because it just protects them so much from what the landlord can't protect them from. And I think the industry has done a pretty good job of educating and adopting almost mandatory renters insurance. It's not very expensive for the consumer.
No, it's very inexpensive, and what we found is the majority of renters didn't even know they needed insurance. They sort of felt like, hey, it's a nice
Right.
place. I'm paying a lot of money. Something bad happens to me, the property owner or landlord is going to take care of me.
Yeah, it's a common misunderstanding.
In fact, Bob, I'm having a little bit of a flashback. I think Kennedy Wilson was one of my early Leasing Desk renters insurance customers, if I think about that right.
Maybe so. Yeah, very well could be. What years was that?
2002, 3, somewhere in there.
Yeah, that's when I was there. We were running our own management company then before we went to a party. And maybe you dealt with an old colleague of mine, Chris Huber.
That may be right. It's been,
Yeah.
I'd have to go
He's
back
a
to my notes.
He's a Texas guy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. See, we go way back, Dirk. We just didn't know it.
We didn't even know it. Well, that's the real estate business, as you all know, Bob. Everybody, it's 2 degrees of separation of, a dozen or so people that are the people that kind of started this business, whether it's Trammell Crow or, any of those.
That's why relationships matter.
That's right.
People ask me, I say, boy, you guys raise a lot of capital. I said, we transact in relationship capital.
Mm-hmm.
That counts just as much. But let's just take a quarter of a step back here because now you're going to be returning to RealPage after you left in 2013. But before we talk about that, I just want to go back and make sure the viewers really understand because not everybody uses prop tech. Not everybody's familiar with that. And you've been in the space almost 3 decades and it's really early onset. Maybe you can walk through the various eras of it from the 80s to the 2000s. There was digitization. We had Yardi, we had CoStar. We're just starting to get into it going that far back, about 4 decades. Maybe speak a little bit about that and so forth. It would be helpful.
Yeah, I think the first sort of wave, as I'd call it, was just the automation of the rent collection process. Even Western National when I was there in the 80s, we were still taking checks. We were writing out hand receipts. There was a ledger system that was used. It was a one write system with NCR where, the rents were sort of, logged. And that was the automation of that process. Like, how do we just, have sort of a front end billing and AR system? And that was what sort of, rent roll and on-site and AMSI and all these first generation companies, MRI, that was really how they got built, was around just that, automating that single process. It was, accounting for leasing and rents. I would say the next phase was then, how do you automate other workflows? How do you create efficiencies around, tenant acquisition? That's where CoStar came to play with, how do we find and curate all the available places that customers can rent at in a more efficient way, kind of using the web? How do you automate the process of online applications and finding background checks and screening and all of those processes? How do we automate this insurance process? How do you automate the procurement process? So there was these individual little pieces of, hey, here's a big problem. How do we automate that one process? In fact,
Really
a lot
more
of go ahead.
automation is really where it started.
Automation with a bias towards how do I control what happens at the on-site level more efficiently, right? We've got a distributed product. It's hard to know what's going on. So how do we create automations that also give us sort of controls, centralization around, enforcing policies and procedures, but
Right.
also on, hey, how do I reduce headcount at the property by, X, or how do I, improve my NOI by Y?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the bigger companies have toyed with self-guided tours and all sorts of little things like that, but everybody has a different opinion. So then we kind of move to what I'm going to call the cloud era, 2000 and 2019. You're seeing RealPage come on the scene. Yardi's advancing. We've got Entrata, the residential side, Zillow. Talk about this era of the cloud-based next steps in the proptech era.
Yeah, so if the first wave was sort of automating these processes, once you sort of put everything in the cloud, it opened up opportunities to layer on additional functionality. And a lot of that was started around, sort of performance optimization, around, better visibility and benchmarking. And so now you have all this data in one place. You have the ability to share data or have data from multiple, companies, and you're able to sort of, hey, so you're doing X, and here's three other peers of yours that are doing Y, right? You could go get rents off of CoStar, and you very easily figure out where you stood in terms of your rent collection charges. You could figure out what are you spending for insurance per door versus your other properties in the area and that sort of thing. And so the cloud really made that possible in a very efficient, scalable way to have all of this information sort of normalized in a standard data schema, but also, in a way that it was pretty easy to sort of slice it and dice it in a lot of different ways.
And that is still being utilized, but now we're coming into the current decade, and AI is really now at the forefront of the next step of PropTech. Agentic, you guys are launching a product, Lumina. I don't know, is that one and the same?
Yeah, we have a suite of products we call Lumina AI Workforce, which sort of, if we automated the process the first time or made it automated for a human, now we've got agentic or automations of those processes where they can become sort of human in the loop, but much more efficient and rapid, using these agents to go perform various functions that were previously just computerized from the paper workflows.
So here we are. We'll come back to that as well. Would you argue that COVID was really what made a huge leap forward because of the way COVID separated us and the ability to work remotely and virtual tours and all this? Do you think COVID was really a major catalyst in the whole inflection point of property technology?
Absolutely. I know even in our Zego business, there was still the majority of payments made for rent were made with an old-fashioned paper check that was dropped off in a little metal mailbox on the side of the leasing office. And that forced massive adoption of digital payments because people, the leasing offices weren't open.
Oh, I got the check. Didn't you see it? Oh, no. We had many of those conversations many years ago.
I think it also accelerated the digital resident engagement. So you, as an owner, your leasing office wasn't open. You had to communicate health and safety information to your tenants, your residents. And so it became, the portal systems and the mobile applications were much more widely adopted because you had to get information out to those folks. Certainly self-guided tours, had a very rapid adoption just because, hey, I got products and I can't have people go show them the vacant units. So, here's a great way to be able to, find a lead and give them a code and have them go tour the property and see where they want to live.
Yep, exactly. Um, let's move over to RealPage in of itself, because that's really the heart and soul of your journey and really become the leader with so many acquisitions. Most people in the industry know who RealPage is, and certainly the federal government knows who RealPage is. As we move through the more progressive populist era, call it what you want, of man versus machine and how it affects the consumer. But it really started as a pretty small property management software company. Walk us through that evolution with Steve when he acquired, I think, RentRoll back in the late 90s, which is really the predecessor, I believe.
That's right.
Maybe speak a little bit about that and its influence on the growth of the company and how it informed the next stages.
Yeah. So a couple things about RentRoll. Number one, I think I talked a little bit about how innovation, most of the innovation in this industry has come from customers. And RentRoll is a perfect example of that. RentRoll is an application that was actually built by the Lincoln Property Company, in the late 80s or I guess early 80s. And it did become part of RealPage. We also bought several other property management systems. One was a system called Little Buddy, which was competing to RentRoll. Little Buddy was actually built by the Johnstown America company. And my good
Great
friend,
name, by the way.
yeah, Little Buddy. Yeah, there was
Very
a
gentle.
little doll.
Yeah.
And actually a very good friend of mine who's had an incredible career in the real estate industry, ran a couple single family platforms. He worked for Sam Zell for a dozen years. He was actually the business analyst on Little Buddy. So
Little Buddy.
Little Buddy.
That's great. Put that on your resume. Little Buddy. Okay.
Little Buddy. But I guess the point is that innovation came from customers out of a real need to say, we know what needs to be coded. We know what needs to be in this product better than anybody because we run this business and we're, in these cases, there were larger owners and they had a very tight business process that they wanted to automate. So they built their software around their current business processes and then quickly realized, we probably shouldn't be in the software business. We're real estate people, and ended up, selling those businesses to Steve. And that was the story of a lot of other of the acquisitions that were made. Ops Technology was sort of incubated by UDR and Camden Property Trust and a couple of others. So many of the products that exist here today were birthed out of a management company or a group
by the REITs. A lot of the REITs.
By the REITs.
LRO, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, LRO was sort of incubated out of Archstone.
Archstone. Unfortunately, Archstone's no longer with us, but its ethos, assets, and its brand have been incorporated into other companies like Avalon and I believe EQR. You acquired YieldStar also. I think that spun out of Camden, another suite of products. How did you were all these products, how did they work together, or were you just sold as different products by you guys? Talk about that, because a lot of them do the same thing.
Yeah, in the case of many of the businesses here, Steve bought half a dozen different companies, and they weren't designed to really work together. I think part of it was market share, part of it was getting subject matter expertise from people that sort of built them and knew what they needed to do and that sort of thing. I mean, YieldStar was actually a product built by a woman by the name of Jennifer Nevitt, and it was really more of a spreadsheet amenity-based pricing kind of system. And then there was a half a dozen other. I mean, that became the name that survived. But what we eventually sold as YieldStar, and that customers use today as YieldStar, has really nothing to do with the original sort of spreadsheet-based amenity-based pricing system that was there. But the notion of, hey, certain units are worth more than other units because they got a better view of the pool, or they've got better accessibility to parking. That concept was integrated into these systems, but it was back then it was fairly unique and new to the industry.
Oh, you're on this sort of semi-acquisition binge. 2010, you decide coming out of the GFC, you're going to go IPO on the
That's
NASDAQ.
right.
You were there for that. You doubled the revenue of the company. Incredible acquisition run begins post-public. Almost 60 deals. Why did you then leave? Or well, tell me about, you must have been part of many of those acquisitions during that time period.
That's right. Variety of reasons. One, it'd been a long run all the way through from starting leasing desk to, doing the public deal, ringing the bell. My deal structure with Steve was one that was heavily back end loaded in terms of the economic opportunity where, I took stock in RealPage as part of the acquisition. I had a pretty material earnout to grow the business. And so, that really became the sale was not really a liquidity event for me. The IPO was the, presumed liquidity event. It wasn't really liquid, but it was certainly an accounting event to your point.
You probably got locked up.
Absolutely. I mean, that's
how it works.
They don't tell you about that part when you dream.
It all sounds sexy and good at the beginning.
That's right. I learned about,
which is why I stay private.
10b5s and stock trading windows and all the other stuff that goes along with it.
Yeah.
And then obviously, having your total compensation disclosed to your, everybody in your friend and family network. So, people realize how much you make and they come out of the woodwork you haven't talked to them in 10 years.
If you're dating, you can just look it up and say, hey, let's check this guy out.
That's right.
So 10 years post-public, acquisition binge, everything from Yield Stars we talked about, to Axiometrics, to Rainmaker, LRO, the whole suite. 2020 comes along and Steve decides, you know what? I'm going to sell this thing. Bingo. Well, Thoma Bravo comes along and for, I think, a cool $10 billion, you're taken private.
That's right. Yeah, as I think I shared with you, I thought it would go private at some point, a couple of years after I left, mostly because the investments that needed to be made to sort of transform the company couldn't be done in the public markets. And, Thoma came along and had a thesis and believed, it was a great platform, it was a great stable end market, and they believed there was value to be created by really finally stitching together the 60 plus acquisitions that have been made. There were half a dozen major pieces to the puzzle, but how do you really kind of stitch those together? And those are fairly material investments and ones that are really hard to make as a public company. You're sort of selling the fact that you're a growth story, that we're going to keep growing at 15, 20% a year, that we're going to continue to get operating leverage with every quarter. And that's a treadmill that it doesn't last forever. And so Thoma was the partner that Steve chose to come in and, help sort of transform the business and, fix the product integrations to fix, and shed maybe some of the businesses that weren't core. There's been at least a couple dispositions of businesses that were bought that probably shouldn't have been bought. And so,
there always is.
Yeah.
And when you aggregate. Before we talk about AI, I have to ask the difficult and obvious question, and you can answer in whatever manner you see fit. But the last couple of years have been much tougher for not only the customer but for you guys in the revenue management business. And RealPage was a huge target. Many states, attorney generals, federal government, all decided to pile in this sort of consumer-friendly, we'll call it, progressive era under the Biden administration, where it started, to see, because we've had this huge affordability issue in the United States. Everybody thinks that this software is simply to raise rents as opposed to making rent setting more efficient. And boom, you've got yourself in the eyes of the Justice Department. How did you unwind that? You stepped into the CEO role during that moment. How did you view what was happening, and what were your thoughts about how to move? I mean, I know there's still litigation pending among a number of states, and I don't expect you to talk about that, but this had to be a very difficult moment for the company.
It was an incredibly difficult moment. Imagine a scenario where you and your customers collectively are drug into a federal government action where many of those customers have been guided by their legal counsels to not communicate with us materially, to not show up at any of our user events or our training events or any of the things where we're talking to the industry about our innovation, where we're showcasing our new products. They were so concerned about being viewed as sharing information with one another or working in cahoots with one another, that they were challenged in working with us. And that's a pretty tough, so not only are you involved in this sort of mutual litigation, but you're not able to really have meaningful conversations with them about the other business that you're doing with them. I mean, revenue management was less than, and remains less than 10% of our total revenue base. We've got a lot of other products that provide a lot of value, but we're not able to talk to our customers about it because of that.
Well, you're the leader in revenue management.
We are the leader in revenue
But
management.
you're the target.
We're
The
the target.
reality that most politicians, let alone people, average citizens, don't understand is the multifamily industry is not an oligopoly. It's not controlled by 6 companies. So there may be a dozen companies that have a large market share, but that market share is relatively small in comparison to the broader ownership of the industry.
That's right.
So there's no way that we could influence pricing across the entire spectrum. It's just impossible. But we can certainly strive to be more efficient for a return on investment of our capital. But I don't know if that message got through in an era where, we're trying to really, in a way, protect the consumer. So you obviously had to make some changes in your suite of products.
We certainly, the products always had we're always compliant. I think we had to explain how our products worked, and how they determined the recommendations that they were making to the property owner customers. Maybe just zooming out a little bit, you sort of touched on this concept of supply and demand.
Yeah.
The real issue is, most experts will conclude, is that we're not building enough housing in this country. I mean, ever since the GFC in 2008, which you touched on, we've been underbuilding. Some people say 1 million households a year. So demand for housing has continued to go up. The number of houses we're building has slowed since the GFC, and we've not ever really fully recovered to the pre-GFC sort of levels. And now the cost to build housing have gotten so high. You're in the development business, way better than I do, but you want to build 300 homes in some area where people want to live. Well, the land, the school fees, the property taxes, the cost of insurance, the construction costs,
gigantic.
they're gigantic. And so it costs you $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 a door to build amenitized housing. You've got to get a return on your investment for your owners. And you can build a lot of product if you can get rents that are $4 or $5 a foot. Problem is people want to pay $2 a foot because that's what their economic situation allows them to pay. And you can't build housing that is $2 a foot. It doesn't.
Which is why we've concentrated on the workforce sector. It's the largest cohort of rentership, and no one really builds for it. They either go Class A or subsidized affordable. And so we have this huge affordability issue that's out there, and that in of itself, due to not enough new construction, is a much bigger part of a bigger problem of quality of life than the software.
Mm-hmm.
But
and maybe
I guess the
out,
federal government figured that out.
I think the federal government figured that out. I'm not sure it's ever going to go away. I think any industry where affordability and pricing is where the supply and demand is misaligned, it's an easy target to, get people elected. And, hey, gas prices are too high. What do we got to do to lower gas prices? Insurance is too high. What do we got to do? Socialize the insurance markets in our state to get insurance prices down so we can get elected, that sort of thing. I do want to make one point on that. We talked about, the supply and demand and how the pricing algorithms work. There's always a lot of focus on, hey, when demand outstrips supply, the software recommends higher prices so you can get supply and demand in balance. We're in several markets now where we're very rapidly guiding rents down in those markets because of the fact
that Austin's the poster child for that.
Austin, Nashville, there's several markets where the super hot built a lot of supply, and so we're now saying, hey, you think you're asking rents and your performing rents should be X, well, we think you should be charging 80% of X.
Yeah, that's why the software is so helpful. Because what we want to do is make sure we're providing the correct rent in order to reduce friction and to get the apartments leased. So it works both ways.
That's right.
It really works both ways. So now we're through that. Let's talk about Lumina and the next evolution of the software and RealPage AI workforce. Give the reader a little bit of, or the listener, a little bit of sense of that and how it's going to work in multifamily, and what your thoughts are behind the whole initiative of Lumina.
So we believe, and maybe even bring this back to affordability, the last real controllable expense that our customers have is labor. Capital markets are fixed or, relatively fixed. Insurance and taxes are, kind of very macro. You're not going to really inflect those too much. But you're probably spending $2,000 to $2,500 a unit a year on labor cost. And we actually think that this agentic AI wave and revolution is going to allow much more efficiency in how those functions are performed, on site, and which will result in, greater efficiency, either reduce labor cost or, more productivity. It's going to allow our owners to, to improve their return. And that, I think in some ways will translate into lower rents, because those owners that have a lower operating cost basis can afford to be more competitive on the top line.
So one of the things that is happening quickly is that the residents' expectations are rapidly evolving. They want digital payment access, they want instant communication, they want all kinds of these support tools. And how do you think about that connection between improving the resident experience and improving the performance of the property? How does it translate to NOI, I guess is what I'm saying.
So, number one, we have data that shows that properties with higher satisfaction scores by residents there's a direct correlation to renewal rates. And so, renewal rates, when they're higher, you have less marketing and advertising cost, you have less vacant day cost, and it certainly improves the NOI for a property when you have happy, satisfied residents that want to renew and want to live with you for a longer period of time. And, we think that these tools allow our customers to provide better service levels to their customers at greater efficiency.
Reducing friction. When you have too much move in, move out, that's money you just never get back.
Yeah, you're never going to recover the vacant days. It's a perishable product. It's like an airline that takes off with empty seats. It's just revenue that's never going to happen. And every day that a unit sits vacant, is a day you're not going to recover from. And so it's very critical to get that right, and to make sure that you're providing great service and that you can minimize those vacant. And that's maybe even doubling back to the revenue management tools. That's one of the things that those tools optimize for, is the number of vacant days. So in other words, a resident says, well, I want to take this apartment, but I don't want to move in for 30 days. That's 30 days you're never going to get back. And so it provides incentives, lower rents, to be able to move in sooner so that you're minimizing those vacant days.
Heads on beds.
Heads on beds.
On beds.
And the other dimension it optimizes for is lease expiration. You don't want 10 units coming vacant on December 31st, because you'll never rent them until the spring, or there's a high likelihood you won't rent them until the spring. And so, it's more expensive to have a lease that expires in a time where it's going to be more difficult to put a head on the bed.
Well said. Well, Dirk, it's been a pleasure having you on here. I got one, maybe two, but I'll start with one parting question. The title of our podcast is called Building Better Communities. And the reason why I named it that is because most of our guests and most of the people I think in this industry are striving to do that in their own way. They're trying to build a better community, but they're also doing things that are either philanthropic or things that are directly outside of their day-to-day. And what are some of your passions as far as community leadership or philanthropy, or things that are meaningful to you?
Yeah, so I'll give you two very different answers. One, I believe that the leasing desk product, the insurance product we have, you and I talked about this, to me, that has a mutual benefit to both the renter and to the landlord. So it's building a better community, in that you've got people that are insured, and that creates better outcomes for all the people that live in that community. So I think that's number one. Second is I'm fairly active in the cancer community. I lost my wife to cancer in 2017, I guess. And
Okay.
so I've been, as part of that, we've been pretty consistent givers to the ovarian cancer causes, the various ovarian cancer causes because of that. So, I'd say that's an important philanthropic cause for me.
Yeah, I recognize that. I've been involved a little bit over the years with the research center out here at the City of Hope, and cancer is something that unfortunately, as we have an aging population, we have to live with and try to get on the other side of. But there's many good things happening thanks to people like yourself and others who are probably behind it. Well, Dirk, pleasure having you, the returning CEO of RealPage, taking it to the modern era. 30 plus years, starting with Orange County, fifth generation Californian. It's just a pleasure to meet you and introduce you to the viewers and have you on here. And I want to wish you a lot of luck in this returning debut at RealPage.
Well, Bob, thank you for the opportunity to, tell my story a little bit. And more importantly, thank you for the opportunity to partner with, a great firm like yours. And we look forward to many years to come.
Yep, I think we're the poster child for you. We love your product. Okay, take care.
Cheers.
Thank you.